It's August 10th, 1934. You're a 47-year-old jeweler named Robert. You live and work in Cincinnati, Ohio, in a shop your father opened in 1901. You inherited the tools, the customers, and the instinct that your father passed on quietly, the way tradesmen pass things on, not in words, but in habits. One of those habits was silver, not jewelry silver, not scrap. Refined bullion bars, 340 troy ounces of them stacked in a steel, safe in the back room, behind the workbench, behind the display cases. You've been buying them one at a time for 12 years, through the worst years of the Depression, through bank closures and bread lines, and 5 consecutive years of watching the dollar behave like a currency that had forgotten what it was supposed to do. You were not a speculator. You were a craftsman who had watched 3 banks in your neighborhood fail between 1930 and 1933, who had seen what happened to the people who kept everything on paper, and who had decided, quietly, methodically, 1 bar at a time, that silver was the thing that couldn't be printed. You were right about the dollar. You're about to find out you were wrong about the silver. Yesterday, August 9th, 1934, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6814. You have 90 days to surrender every ounce of refined silver bullion in your possession to the United States government. Not damaged, not stolen. Required. The government will pay you for it. 50 cents an ounce. The market was at 49 cents when the order was signed. But by the time Robert finishes reading, the document, silver is already rising. By the time his 90 days expire, it will be trading at 81 cents. He will receive 50 cents for an asset worth 81 cents. He will comply because the alternative is a $10,000 fine, the equivalent of more than $500,000 today, or 10 years in federal prison. Robert does everything right. Robert loses anyway. This is not a story about Robert. Robert is just the example that happens to be well documented. This pattern, a government seizing a precious metal from private citizens using a single executive order with a 90-day deadline and a criminal penalty, has happened. Not in Germany, not in Venezuela, not in some distant country you can tell yourself is different. Here, in the United States, in your country. And the law they used to do it is not gone. It was replaced. Most people, when they imagine a government confiscating silver, picture something dramatic. Armed agents, raids at dawn, locked doors, chaos in the streets. That is not what Executive Order 6814 looked like. Executive Order 6814 looked like paperwork. It looked like a form. It looked like a walk to your nearest U.S. Mint, Philadelphia, San Francisco, or Denver, carrying a bag of silver bars, signing a receipt, and walking out with a check. The government didn't break down your door. It published a deadline. It mailed notifications. It created something called the Hoarders of Silver list, compiled from COMEX trading records, identifying the largest holders before the order was signed. And it enforced compliance not with soldiers, but with a penalty larger than most men earned in 10 years of work. Not raids, not soldiers, paperwork and a deadline. That distinction matters more than it might seem, because the instinct that protects most people from worrying about this, the instinct that says they could never actually do that, there would be chaos, there would be resistance. That instinct is calibrated for the wrong kind of threat. The threat that took Robert Silver was bureaucratic, administrative, quiet. The stores were still open, the courts were still functioning. The government simply published the form, mailed the deadline, and waited. 109 million ounces arrived at U.S. mints within 90 days. Voluntary compliance at scale. Not because people wanted to surrender their silver, because the alternative was a prison sentence, and because the machinery of the state had been configured, carefully, legally, through existing channels, to make compliance the only rational choice. What happened in 1934 is not an anomaly. It follows a pattern that repeats when three conditions are present simultaneously. First, a government under severe fiscal stress. Second, a population holding assets the government cannot print. Third, a legal instrument already on the books that give the executive the power to act. In 1934, all three were present. The question is not whether those conditions existed then. The question is whether they exist now. We will get there. But first, how did this particular order come to be signed? The standard explanation for Executive Order 6814 is that it was an emergency measure. A wartime-style economic intervention necessary to stabilize the monetary system during the worst economic crisis in American history. That framing is not entirely wrong, but that is not the whole story. The whole story is considerably more uncomfortable. To understand what actually happened, you have to go back to 1932. Silver prices had collapsed to 25 cents per ounce, the lowest price in recorded history. In Nevada, Montana, Idaho, Colorado, and 4 other western states, silver mining was the economic foundation, the employer, the tax base, the reason those communities existed. At 25 cents an ounce, those communities were dying. Mines were closing. Towns were emptying. Senator Key Pittman of Nevada understood this better than anyone in Washington. He also understood something else. He led a bloc, 14 senators from 7 silver-producing states who voted together and whose support Franklin Roosevelt urgently needed to pass the broader New Deal legislation that was his administration's core agenda. What followed was not monetary policy. It was a deal. Time magazine, covering the passage of the Silver Purchase Act in 1934, described what happened in terms that would not be used in a university economics textbook. A little block of Western Silver State senators, the magazine reported, by vote trading, log rolling, wheedling, and threatening, thrust the 1934 Act down the unwilling throats of Messrs. Roosevelt and Morgenthau. Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau hated the silver program. Roosevelt himself did not believe silver was a serious monetary solution. He had promised in a campaign speech in Butte, Montana, silver must be restored as monetary metal and the Democratic platform. So, pledges the party. And he was now collecting on that promise whether he wanted to or not. The Silver Purchase Act passed on June 19, 1934. Executive Order 6814 followed on August 9, 1934. 51 days from enabling legislation to executive order. The mechanism here is important to understand. Executive Order 6814 did not require Congress to pass a new law granting the President confiscation power. It did not require a constitutional amendment. It did not require the kind of legal architecture that would take months or years to assemble. The President used a power that was already there, built into Section 5(b) of the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917, amended by the Emergency Banking Act of 1933 to extend presidential emergency authority into peacetime. The same legal architecture that had been used the year before, in April 1933, for the gold confiscation under Executive Order 6102. The $10,000 fine and the 10-year prison term in EO 6814 were copied verbatim from EO 6102. The template existed. The only variable was which asset to apply it to. The law was a tool. The emergency was declared. The tool was used. But here is what is less discussed, and it matters for understanding the full scope of what domestic policy decisions of this kind can do. In 1934, China was still on a silver standard. Its currency was backed by and denominated in silver. When the United States Silver Purchase Act drove global silver prices sharply higher. Because American demand was suddenly bottomless, the value of Chinese silver backed. Currency appreciated in tandem. Chinese exports became uncompetitive overnight. Foreign silver was drained out of China as international holders sold into the American government's buying program. Real estate transactions in Shanghai fell by more than 92% between 1931 and 1934. China experienced deflation severe enough that it was forced entirely off the silver standard in November 1935, not by its own monetary policy, but by American domestic politics. Mexico began exchanging its silver coins for paper money under the same price pressure. A political deal between Franklin Roosevelt and 14 senators from 7 western states destroyed the monetary system of the world's most populous country. Not intentionally, not maliciously, as a side effect, as collateral damage from the vote trading in a Senate chamber in Washington, D.C., in the spring of 1934. That is the scale of what a single executive order touching silver can do. Think about what that means. So that is how Executive Order 6814 was born. A political deal, a legal tool already in place, 51 days from enabling law to executive order. But the more important question, the question Robert was asking in his back room in Cincinnati, was how it worked. What actually happened to the people it reached? The terms of Executive Order 6814 were precise. All refined silver bullion at a fineness above .800, meaning silver bars, silver dust, silver in its pure investable form, was to be delivered to one of 3 U.S. mint locations, Philadelphia, San Francisco, or Denver. The government would cover shipping and insurance. The logistics were deliberately seamless. There was no friction in the surrender process. The friction was entirely on the side of non-compliance. Compensation, $0.5001 per fine troy ounce. For domestically mined silver, $0.645, a politically motivated premium designed to reward the Western mining interests whose senators had delivered the legislation. Penalty for non-compliance, a $10,000 fine, or 10 years in federal prison, or both. $10,000 in 1934 is the equivalent of more than $500,000 today. The prison term is self-explanatory. Deadline, 90 days from August 9th, 1934. Before the order was signed, the Treasury Department had compiled what they called the Hoarders of Silver list. It was built from COMEX trading records, the paper trail left by anyone who had bought or held significant quantities of silver bullion through official channels. The list prioritized holders of 50,000 ounces or more. But it was not a secret list. It was the enforcement infrastructure. It meant that when the 90 days began, the government already knew who held the silver. Compliance was not a matter of good faith. It was a matter of whether you believed the government already had your name. The answer, for the vast majority of holders, was yes. The exemptions are where the mechanism reveals something important about who a law like. This actually protects industrial users, jewelers, silversmiths, manufacturers could apply for a license from the Treasury Secretary to retain silver needed for their trade. Foreign silver coins were exempt. Rare and collectible coins were partially exempt, though the definition of rare was left deliberately vague. Silver below .800 fineness was exempt. On paper, these exemptions looked generous. In practice, the exemptions required institutional resources, lawyers, license applications, the ability to navigate a federal bureaucracy on a 90-day timeline. Large manufacturing operations with legal counsel obtained exemptions. Robert enters Cincinnati, operating a single-room jewelry shop with no Washington connections, had no mechanism to pursue one. The law was technically neutral. Its application was not. The people most likely to lose their silver were the ones who had accumulated it the way Robert had, carefully, individually, outside institutional channels, precisely because they did not trust the institutional financial system. Compliant, legal, unprotected. Within 90 days, 109 million fine ounces of silver arrived at U.S. Mint locations across the country. Another 4 million ounces arrived before the order was rescinded in 1938, when the government decided it had enough. 113 million ounces total, acquired through a form, a deadline, and a criminal penalty that nobody wanted to test. Here's the thing about 109 million ounces. That number doesn't represent raiders and resistors and dramatic confiscations at gunpoint. It represents Robert, multiplied by hundreds of thousands. Men and women who walked into a mint location, signed a receipt, accepted a check, and walked out believing they had done the right thing. That they had been law-abiding. That compliance would be its own protection. It was not. But here is the critical detail that most histories skip. Not what happened during the confiscation, what happened after. Once the government had acquired the silver, silver prices rose. The government's own Silver Purchase Act, the legislation that had enabled the confiscation, required the Treasury to continue buying silver in the open market until it held silver equal to 1/3 of its monetary metal reserves, or until the price of silver reached $1.29 per ounce, whichever came first. That buying program was already underway. It was the reason silver prices had been rising before the confiscation order was even signed. Robert surrendered his 340 ounces at 50 cents. Within months, the market price for silver had risen to 81 cents per ounce. He had received 50 cents for an asset worth 81 cents, not because the government had lied about the market price on August 9th, but because the government's own purchasing program drove the price up after his silver was in the Treasury's hands. He surrendered on the floor. The government held through the ceiling, the gap between what he received and what his silver was soon worth. That is the transfer, not the confiscation itself. The transfer embedded in the timing. The gold confiscation of 1933 followed the identical mechanism. Citizens surrendered gold at $20.67 per ounce, the legal price at which gold had been valued for decades. 6 months later, the Gold Reserve Act of 1934 revalued gold to $35 per ounce. The government had just paid $20.67 for something it immediately declared to be worth $35. The people who complied, who were law-abiding, who walked to the bank and handed over their gold, lost 41% of their gold's value overnight. Not through fraud, not through theft. Through the legal, orderly, published, government-sanctioned process of setting the buyback. Price before the government's own actions inflated the asset. Same pattern, same mechanism, 1 year apart. Here is the irony that sits at the center of both orders. Robert bought silver because he correctly identified that the dollar was being debased. He was right, the dollar was being debased. The government was printing money, inflating, devaluing. Robert's analysis was accurate. His conclusion, hold silver to protect yourself from the dollar, was the logical response to an accurate analysis. The government then confiscated his silver at a price it set before its own inflationary policies drove that silver's price higher. He surrendered the appreciating asset. He received the depreciating currency. At the exact moment the gap between the two was widest. He was not wrong about economics. He lost because he was right. At the wrong moment, in the wrong legal environment, under the wrong administration. Being right is not the same as being protected. Not when the government has already written the law. If you are watching this and realizing that the history you are told about precious metals, that the government would never touch them, that this kind of thing only happened during the Depression, that those days are over, is missing some chapters, subscribe. This channel is Financial Forensics. We go through the autopsies so you understand the anatomy before the next one happens. It is free. Unlike the financial literacy that a system built on accelerating debt has a structural incentive to withhold from you. Now back to 1934 and what it tells us about today. The pattern I've just walked you through: fiscal stress, political deal, legal instrument, confiscation, price rise, transfer, requires 3 conditions. We established this at the beginning. The question was whether those conditions exist now. Let's go through them one at a time, not as speculation, as a structural audit. Condition 1, a government under severe fiscal stress. The United States national debt stands at $38 trillion as of early 2026 and is accelerating. For the first time in American history, the federal government is spending more on interest payments on past debt than it spends on national defense. Every year, the government runs a deficit larger than the entire annual GDP of most countries on Earth. The dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves has declined from roughly 80% in the mid-1970s to approximately 65% today. The same trajectory that Britain's sterling traveled during the decades before it lost reserve currency status entirely. Gold hit $5,626 per ounce intraday on January 29, 2026. Silver reached $113 per ounce before experiencing a 31% flash crash. COMEX registered silver inventories fell to all-time lows as institutional demand competed with investment demand for a shrinking pool of available metal. These are not normal price movements. These are market pricing and debasement at scale. Condition 1 is present, not theoretically, quantifiably. Condition 2. A population holding assets the government cannot print. Silver holders clearly satisfy this condition. But here is what is different about 2026 that did not exist in 1934. In 1934, the government wanted silver because silver backed currency. That logic is gone. The dollar is not on a silver standard, but silver has acquired a new strategic value that has nothing to do with monetary metals. The AI economy runs on silver, solar panels, EV batteries, the circuit connections in data center servers. The electrical infrastructure of the 21st century requires silver at industrial scale, and there is no substitutable alternative for most of its critical applications. Hyperscale technology companies spent $443 billion in capital. Expenditures in 2025 alone building AI infrastructure. The Stargate project in Texas is planned. As a $500 billion investment, that infrastructure requires silver that is not currently inadequate. Supply. A government that decided to secure its industrial AI base could make a strategic case for silver. Acquisition that would have no historical precedent, therefore no established legal. Challenge template. The motive in 1934 was monetary. The motive in 2026 would be strategic. Different reasons. Same mechanism. Condition 2 is present, and it is more complex than it was in 1934. Condition 3. A legal instrument already on the books. The Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917, the legal foundation of Executive Order 6814, is gone. It was replaced in 1977 by the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA, not abolished, not repealed. replaced with something broader. From 1979 through mid-2025, 89 national emergencies were declared under the National Emergencies Act. 82 of them invoked IEEPA. The average declared emergency lasts nearly 9 years. As of early 2026, 39 national emergencies remain active. Emergencies that have been renewed annually, year after year, for an average of nearly a decade each. In 2025, the President invoked IEEPA to impose tariffs on nearly all U.S. trading partners. An application the Supreme Court ultimately struck down as not explicitly authorized by IEEPA's text, but in doing so, the court reaffirmed the broad scope of presidential emergency economic powers. In 1934, Franklin Roosevelt needed to declare one emergency to seize silver. Today, the emergencies are already declared, 39 of them active, renewable, legally sanctioned by Congress and validated by decades of executive use. Condition 3 is not merely present, it is structural. We are not in uncharted territory. We are looking at a mechanism that was perfected in 1934, built on a legal architecture that has been expanded, not restricted, in the 90 years since. The only variable that was present in 1934 and requires assessment today is the political will. In 1934, the political will was supplied by 14 senators from 7 western states who held the new deal hostage until silver was on the agenda. Political will of that kind does not require a depression. It requires the right combination of fiscal pressure, a strategic asset, and a Congress that has already given the executive the tools. Here is what the autopsy shows. Executive Order 6814 was not an aberration. It was not a Depression-era anomaly that belongs to a category of things that cannot happen in a functioning modern democracy. It was a legal instrument constructed for other purposes, sitting on the books, waiting, applied to. Precious metals when 3 conditions aligned: fiscal desperation, political deal-making, and an asset in private hands that the government decided it needed. Those 3 conditions required 5 years of economic crisis to assemble in 1934. Today, the fiscal desperation is structurally larger than it was in the Depression. The legal instrument has been expanded, not restricted. The emergencies are already declared. The strategic case for silver, an argument that did not exist in 1934, is now being written by the AI economies. Insatiable demand for the one metal it cannot substitute. The precedent exists, the mechanism is documented. The legal architecture is broader today than it was when Roosevelt signed the order on August 9, 1934. Robert was a 47-year-old jeweler in Cincinnati who spent 12 years accumulating silver, 1 bar at a time, because he correctly identified that the dollar was being debased. He was right. He held silver as a hedge against a monetary system he accurately understood to be unstable. And on August 10, 1934, he opened a government document and discovered that being right is not the same as being protected. Not when the government has already written the law. Not when the tool is already in place. Not when the conditions are already assembled. If this changed how you think about what you own and who has the legal authority to require you to surrender it, subscribe. The history of what governments have done to private assets is the history most financial education skips. We don't skip it here. I'll see you at the next autopsy.